help people make decisions that have to do with us and not decisions for us. Today is, I think, a really exciting and very important conversation to do with culture. A couple things just to start us off. This is a recorded video. If you do not wish to have your face on it, there is an option on your computer where you can click on stop video, and then you won't have your face. And there's also the mute button. Ngozi will talk for about 20-25 minutes, at which you can put up your hand and we'll have some conversation. Ngozi, I believe you are inviting questions throughout. Is that correct?
I am, yes.
Okay. So feel free to have put your hand up, and we can certainly facilitate that question for you at that time. I think that's all the important stuff. Ngozi, here we go. So welcome everyone, and again, thank you, Ngozi.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Ngozi Urania. I am a PhD student at York University in Health Policy and Equity Studies. And I'm here to talk with you about culturally appropriate dementia care and Canada's role in providing that, and sort of what are the impacts on immigrant seniors. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. Personally, my father has dementia. He is an immigrant from Nigeria, but been in the country since the early 70s. So as we've been going through his journey and our journey with him, thinking about the ways that care has impacted his health status and the experience for the family members and the community at large. That's sort of the background for my work. So I'm just going to go right ahead and get into it. So my dissertation for my PhD is around dementia care policy and impact on immigrant seniors. And that helped me to formalize what I wanted to talk about today and what I wanted to look at today. So does Canada provide culturally appropriate dementia care? So the first aspect of that is that by definition, there is no such thing as culturally appropriate dementia care. It is, though, a concept that's very, very important. If I were to put it into some sort of framing or some sort of words, culturally appropriate dementia care incorporates aspects of both terms of cultural competency and cultural safety. And these terms sort of really help to incorporate the cultural needs, perspectives of people with dementia who practice non-Canadian cultural practices, and how these practices may impact their health journey. So through this, I was looking at ways to promote positive attitudes that foster trust and understanding in health relationships between those with dementia and their healthcare providers and community at large across cultures. So not just within the Canadian context, but within other contexts as well. That's sort of where I got that from. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why is this important? Well, a lot of things have been happening lately within the Canadian landscape, the demographic landscape. So since 2016, our national census has revealed that for the first time in our history, in Canadian history, those who are 65 and older have actually outnumbered those who are 0 to 14 years of age. So what we're actually seeing is a very rapidly aging population in Canada, which in itself would really have policymakers and programmers be thinking about healthcare needs for seniors. Alongside of that, though, we also have an increase in the number of those born outside of the country. So in 2016, 1 out of every 5 people said that they were foreign born. That's about 22% of the population. To that, Asia and Africa were the 2 biggest continents that people were coming from. So what we're finding is an aging population and a more culturally and racially diverse population as well in tandem. And as we all know, when people come to this country, they stay in Canada, and they tend to grow older in Canada as well. Estimations put by 2036, about 30% of the population are going to be foreign born. So these are just some numbers and some broader contexts by which we're going to be looking at some of this research. Next slide, please. Thank you. So though we have a larger amount of immigrants coming to Canada, and we have a rapidly aging population, common to both of those experiences are health-related issues, including dementia. So first off and foremost, dementia is not a part of the normal aging process. That's often a misconception that people hold, that someone is getting older, that they're going to develop dementia and be quote unquote forgetful, but dementia is not part of the aging process though. To that, however, people who are 65 and older tend to be diagnosed a bit more frequently. That's not an absolute number though. Those who are 30 or under 40 anyway, can also be diagnosed, but it is seen more in those 65. Current estimates, there's a range actually of those who have dementia in Canada. Current estimates though are about 564,000. But the most important thing to realize about that as well is that that number is poised to increase to 937,000 by 2031, not that far off. Now that number though, 564,000, 500, now that's a range as well, but also there could be a lot of underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis within that, so that number could actually be higher. Monetary wise, dementia care costs are very exorbitant. They're about $16.6 billion. That's projected by 2031. And that's for healthcare costs and for out-of-pocket costs, so things that aren't covered for through OHIP and through subsidies and what have you. Next slide, please. So what we actually have, we have an increasingly aging, racialized, and culturally diverse population who are immigrants. And this population is going to have unique dementia health needs, primarily because they're going to have a different set of social determinants of health. So the way they experience non-medical, non-biological impacts on their health. So things like housing, things like employment, like education, is going to have an impact on their health status. So for what I did is I used an intersectional framework to understand the impacts of dementia services on health equity for immigrant seniors. Now that term, intersectional framework, probably you're asking yourself, what does that mean? And I'm going to talk about that in a few slides, but just want to continue on. Next slide, please. So in answer to the question overall, does Canada provide culturally appropriate dementia care? So in a nutshell, currently right now, Canada has the federal dementia strategy, which was released just this year. And they also have, provinces also have their own dementia strategies that they use and that they have their own unique vision, mandate, and approaches to that. Overall though, between the federal strategy and the provincial strategies, what you actually have is you have an emphasis on dementia research, including clinical therapies and interventions. You have an emphasis on caregiver supports, how to support caregivers more. You have an emphasis on in-home services and health systems as well. There's a focus on vulnerable populations and especially stigma reduction and awareness. So at large, there are numerous services and agencies at the government and local level that provide care and support to people with dementia, though they're not specific to culturally diverse immigrant populations. So we don't actually have governmental, either provincial or federal, specifically for an immigrant cultural population. What you would have at most, you would have local community organizations, either as a community or even in a health aspect, who would deliver services to largely a specific immigrant population, but it's not solely and exclusively for them. So as it stands, there are gaps in services for culturally diverse immigrant seniors. Next slide, please. Thank you. So from my research, I have found that there are significant barriers to accessing dementia care. That's really reflective of the lived experience of culturally diverse immigrant seniors. My intersectional approach is going to look at that. But first I want to talk about what some of those barriers are. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the challenges that immigrant seniors have noted in research are things like language barriers, understanding the medical terminology that comes along with a diagnosis of dementia or an investigation of dementia-like symptoms. It's one thing to speak English, and then it's another thing entirely to speak English in a medicalized context. So there are some barriers there to care. Another barrier, a challenge rather, is cultural perspectives of dementia that differ from the Western approach. So in some cultures don't actually even have a word for dementia. Some cultures may construe dementia to be something grounded in more social, cultural, or religious, and maybe not biomedical. The research also found there was a lack of trust amongst some immigrant senior populations in the healthcare system. So how to engage in the healthcare system so that they feel properly supported, respected, and seen. To that as well, research did show cultural competency of healthcare providers and institutions. So healthcare providers and institutions, they have a mandate to provide healthcare. And it's a very, very real issue and concern when they are not able to, or feel they don't have enough support to bridge cultural gaps with some of their clients who present with dementia-like symptoms. And so that can sort of lead to gaps in either diagnosis, either in having compliant people with dementia to treatment, and as well as supporting the family members if they're experiencing challenges in supporting their family member with dementia. Another issue is immigration status. Some immigrant seniors come to Canada on the family reunification visa, which means that they're coming here after their children have supported them. That actually means that their children are responsible for their care and for things that they need. That makes an assumption that children are able to do that. And that leads into the next issue, which is family reliance and structure. A lot of times there are adult children who are taking care of their parents, and adult children are sort of trapped in that sandwich generation where they're taking care of younger children, if they have, and older parents as well, while trying to work and maintain a household. When you factor in immigration status and cultural diversity, that load can be significant for caregivers and for family members. Lack of social inclusion and lack of social capital and feelings of social inclusion. So if those who come to Canada and don't have children, and let's say they are experiencing dementia-related issues, they may not have a family structure or enough supportive network to actually support them as they go through this. And then research also showed a lack of coordinated care between immigrant settler agencies and dementia agencies. So coming to Canada, for the most part, people are going to go to an immigrant agency for settlement to help them get adjusted, to help them meet people, to help them network. If they are experiencing dementia-related issues or a loved one is, for example, immigrant settlement agencies and dementia agencies don't necessarily have that communication and have that link, so that you're sort of passing one individual off to one institution, and they can kind of get into a back and forth routine while they're looking to access appropriate care. Next slide, please.
Ngozi, I'm just wondering if
Sure.
this might be a good opportunity to check in with our audience.
Absolutely.
And see if there's some questions out there.
Absolutely.
If so,
questions?
Do we see any questions? You can raise your hand.
Is there a Stephanie, I think, has a question.
Oh, Stephanie. Let's get you unmuted there, Stephanie.
Appreciate your topic. My biggest question for you, which is going to be very difficult, is I totally agree with everything, but it came up on one of the conferences, work groups I worked on, that we have to even go down as far as in long-term care facilities, the food that we're serving, and how sometimes culturally, excuse me, culturally, they revert and we're not providing food that they would have normally eaten. Some cultures don't eat oatmeal for breakfast. Right. And so getting this oatmeal for breakfast is not going to be dementia friendly or dementia sensitive.
Right, and that's a great question, Stephanie. Thank you for that. I'm going to be addressing that towards the end of my talk. There are some things that some recommendations that I've sort of come up with that might be helpful for those in different capacities. So thank you. Excellent question.
Thank you. And I believe Naomi has a question for you.
Yes, I was just going to ask, where are you, sorry, I missed the first 3 minutes, so you may have already explained this, but I'm just wondering where you are sourcing this data from that you're collecting.
So the data that I'm sourcing it from is secondary data. It's from largely research studies that have been done across Canada, out in BC, out in the East as well, in Ontario, and sort of looking at those who have done research on immigrant senior populations, largely from BC, so South Asian populations, Chinese speaking and Korean speaking populations as well.
Okay. And then the other question I was going to ask is that do you have a breakdown of, I guess, the senior populations, like what the ethnicity is that's
Yep.
the highest level of dementia rate?
Yep. So from the research, the highest, the most representation of the seniors groups are South Asian,
Okay.
followed that by Chinese speaking as well. The groups that are most underrepresented are from the African Black Caribbean group, as well as Latin American group as well. And if we're being concise in immigrant experiences, those from Eastern Europe as well, I have not seen a lot of research on, which just for me leads to the conclusion that more research needs to be done throughout the country and within provinces that have high immigrant populations to really understand what's happening in those communities. Because again, not every community is created equal, right? So there are some nuances that can be seen across immigrant populations, but what's specific to South Asian may not be specific to someone who's from Bolivia, someone who's from Russia, someone who's from South Africa. So part of my research is also a bit of advocacy as well for more research to be done within these populations. That's part of my own my PhD work that I'm going to be doing.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for putting forward that work then.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Mary, over to you for a question. Can we get you unmuted there?
Unmute myself. Okay, got it. Sorry, I just came in from the car from an appointment. So you haven't spoke firsthand with organizations such that actually run the Chinese programs or South Asian programs, etc. Have you?
No, not as yet. No.
Okay. I think that will be an important part because the that actually has some good to connect because especially there's like met some people from Yifeng and their wait list for Chinese senior in Toronto is 10 years, which is much longer than the average.
Yes.
And it's a case where there are it's hard to actually quantify the different groups and the impact on the wait list. There are some specific ethnic focused homes, not just the Chinese, but there's a Jewish home in Ottawa. There is a Italian one, but they're usually smaller homes.
Yes, there's a Jewish one up here in North York, and there's one Italian one as well, and I think it's in Vaughan as well. Yes, there are some specific ones, but those are sort of private, I believe.
Yeah. They're usually nonprofit, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, they usually.
Sorry, by private I mean not by the government. Yeah.
So Mary, it sounds like you have some good information that you might want to talk to Ngozi about.
Yeah, maybe. Okay.
Hook you guys up.
Yeah. Okay. I'll leave some of the others on later.
Okay. So, okay. I think I'm going to hang on to this one more question you have so that we can go through a few more slides, and after that, Naomi has another question for you. Okay.
Sure.
But let's get you back to your slides and keep those questions coming.
Perfect. So the framework that I actually use is intersectionality. Intersectionality, it's kind of it's not a new topic or a new framework per se, but it is a framework that is becoming more popular, especially in policy circles as well. So intersectionality is a framework to understand the multiple and simultaneous social categories that actually categorize an individual, make up an individual's sort of positionality. So if you see there in the actual little picture I have, you see different words, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and these are sort of your identities that make up an individual. So your race, your class, your gender, your sexual orientation. In this case, I'm also going to include immigration and age. And all of these identities actually make up one individual. So you are not just a woman, you're not just a racialized person, you're not just from a certain immigration status, you are all in tandem. And that holistic individual is actually what has the relationship with the healthcare system in this case. So when the healthcare system interacts with that individual, the treatment of that individual and the individual's treatment within the healthcare system is formed by all of these simultaneous identities acting together. Such that if a woman were to present, say, for example, she is a 77-year-old Bangladeshi grandmother who has come to Canada only a few years ago and speaks very limited English and is now showing signs of dementia, that holistic individual is now encountering the healthcare system. Not just someone who's from Bangladesh, not just a woman, not just an immigrant, not just someone who is 77. In total, that person is encountering the healthcare system. And the healthcare system treats her as that totality. And that is where I began to search for understanding how the experiences are for immigrant seniors. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the health policy context, how does this actually play out? So I was looking at the Ontario Dementia Strategy for part of my research previously, and I was looking at the consultation questions that they asked of the public to help develop their Ontario strategy. The consultation questions were very streamlined, but they also held a lot of assumptions. When you look through the questions and you look at the questions and you analyze them, you see that the questions are assuming that everybody, one, speaks English, everybody, two, understands the medical terminology behind these questions, understands dementia in a Western framework, and understands the experiences of dementia in a Western framework. Those questions, and there's other analyses as well, but those questions, for example, and those findings helped me to formalize that people who don't actually hold those same assumptions, people who don't understand dementia in the same Western framework, people who are from a different socioeconomic conditions who may not be able to afford certain things that the strategy called for, would in fact be left out, and their voices and experiences would not be represented in the resulting strategies and policies for them. So an intersectional framework allowed me to see how these policies did have some gaps that were going to have implications for immigrant seniors and their health status. Looking at policies right now, intersectionality helps to go beyond a one-size-fits-all approach to policy. So policy can sometimes be implemented that has a sort of a general sort of approach, but people fall outside of that scope. It can also have a singularity of personhood. So thinking about policy that only affects women, but within the category of women, there are racialized women, different sexual orientations of women, people who don't identify as women. So there's different considerations of that that intersectionality helped me to see. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, as we talk about intersectionality, though, it's very important to note that intersectionality does have its challenges in the theoretical and the practical applications of it. Some of these challenges include how many cultures are to be incorporated. When we talk about immigrant seniors and cultural diversity, there's many cultures, and it is not obviously, it's not feasible to know every single culture and every single food and every single approach to dementia for a person with dementia from different cultures. As well, holding which culture holds primacy and for how long and what capacity, what methodology is used, and when and how is intersectionality to be applied to policy and programs. So these are all challenges, all very well important challenges, and they're still being explored and discovered within the field of research with intersectionality. So researchers are still developing best approaches for applicability of intersectionality frameworks. There are some other frameworks that I do use as well. I can talk about that later if anyone's interested. One is the intersectionality-based policy analysis. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but I can certainly talk to those who are interested after the fact. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So to that, though, there are some things that can be done. to how we can incorporate intersectionality and how we can incorporate different diverse cultural experiences in policy and programming. These are recommendations. The first one I was thinking about was a focus at the policy level, was a focus on community-based research and interventions that feature strong multi-sectorial partnerships with key stakeholders and multi-levels of government. So what that really means is having strong multi-levels of government and strong multi-sectorial partnerships between government agencies and forces and community-based organizations. So you can actually set up a relationship of mutual knowledge, mutual respect, and mutual skill sharing as well. For those who are on the ground, meeting this population on the ground and supporting them and the policies that are being developed, there can be a cross link and stronger coordination between those two branches to help better support community organizations and to help translate that knowledge back to policies to have more inclusive policies. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. For practitioners, and Stephanie, this is to your point and to your question, a focus on community-based interventions that can be based in a medicalized setting. So increasing cultural competency and safety for diverse populations. So for that, I was thinking about developing partnerships with local organizations to foster the knowledge sharing and capacity building that, one, helps to destigmatize dementia and build trust amongst diverse communities, and also the knowledge and capacity from those communities can be passed back along to the institutions and healthcare providers. So again, we're having a shared relationship of knowledge and capacity building on both sides. Now, how that could be operationalized and developed is all specific to each institution, be it a hospital, a clinic, doctor's office, or whatever have you, but you could leverage cultural health advocates within the community that you're working largely with. You could leverage community health workers as well and start building those relationships and start having those conversations alongside of policy development that's being started. Can I have the next slide, please? So ultimately, my presentation and my research is I want to ensure that all people with dementia are represented in dementia care policies and programs. I want to enable better access to quality dementia care that's equitable, that's dignified, and that's safe for people with dementia, for their families and their communities. Because as we all understand, dementia doesn't affect one person, it affects everyone around them, and it affects the community, and it affects our society. Thank you so very much for listening. Is there any questions or comments? I very much welcome them. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi.
Thank you.
Now, we have two questions right off the hop.
Sure.
Let's see. Let me go up a little bit. And we're just going to unmute the person, and then you can ask the question and then go from there. Naomi, you have a question. We'll start with you. And then
I had a question. Yeah, I had a couple questions here. So you said that right now your intersectionality framework is the one that you're using, and I think it makes perfect sense why you're using it. I'm just wondering, what were previous frameworks that you were using before you did mention that, and when have you seen the change to this one that's taking so many more things into account?
Thanks, Naomi. So previous frameworks have been social determinants of health framework and health equity frameworks. And those are very, very wonderful and very inclusive frameworks. But when I think about social determinants of health, and I think about the 12 determinants, when we think about gender, education, culture, and what have you, the social determinants of health tend to be taken in siloed sort of forms. So when we look at policy and we think about social determinants of health, we think about it in relation to education, period, to gender, period, to socioeconomic status, period. But we're not taking it all in total, in tandem. Intersectionality as well, for policymakers, it does sort of call upon policymakers to have a sense of reflexivity as well, and their positionality and their standpoint in making the policies and developing the policies. So that helps sort of to broaden the context in which these policies are being made and created in. Health equity was another framework as well that was used, a wonderful framework as well. But again, it's looking at the whole person as a person. And I'll give you an example. So my father, he is 81 years young, God bless him. He has dementia. He's now in the beginning of the advanced stage. But by the middle stages, though, he was regressing back to some cultural practices that he was doing as a boy when he was in Nigeria. And his providers would contact me and they would say, you know, why is your father doing this? Why is your father doing that? And they weren't able to really understand where the context was coming from and how best to support him during that context. So one thing my father likes to do, he likes to give really, really hard high fives. And it's something that him and my uncles used to do when I was a kid. They would say, hey, sir, and just like nearly take your hand off. So when my father began doing this in his care facilities, people were very alarmed. They thought he was being aggressive. And I said, that's actually his way of saying hello. It's actually his way of greeting you and you know, trying to make a friend, as it were. And so trying to explain that from a cultural perspective, given the fact that his immigration status as well and where that comes from, that for me thought that there needs to be something more to investigate this besides the 12 determinants, something that's happening in conjunction with other things, not in isolation. That's sort of my context for it. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I mean, it just generates another question that's not what I wrote there, but I think that makes perfect sense, and I'm glad that you're bringing that up. Do you find that people, either nursing staff or caretakers, are receptive to understanding and or learning about the culture of the resident?
100%. Because as Stephanie pointed out before in her question, was that staff, you know, just logistically, staff are very stretched. They have a lot of patients to deal with. They have a lot of administrative duties to deal with as well. And so they may not be able to remember, be able to recall, be able to implement all the cultural nuances. So when you have a family member saying, by the way, my father does this, this, and this, he likes this, this, and this, here is some food, here are some things you guys can think about. It really helps everyone involved. It gives the staff a sense of competency and confidence to actually support their patients. And as well, you know, the experience for those with dementia, actually it's enhanced. They don't feel as isolated, because people with dementia, they may not remember what you said and what you did, but they'll still remember how you made them feel, right? Correct. So keeping that in mind when interacting in those facilities is very helpful.
That's fantastic. And the last question I was going to say was that, have you been seeing an increase in demand for either like home specific to culture or religion?
Well, as Mary said in her question comment previously, the wait list for Chinese speaking seniors is 10 years long, right? And I think for that that's a truth. That's an essential truth. And I think there are other communities and other immigrant communities as well that have people that want to get into homes, but they know that they don't have homes specific for them. So for example, the African community. Africa is a very large continent, yes, and there are very many countries, yes, but the African community, immigrant community at large, if they have those that need to go into a home, there is no African home for them as well at all, right? So putting them in a generalized home, they're going to have some challenges and difficulties. So there is, I feel, a need for that. When I've spoken to people sort of anecdotally, they've said, oh, you know, my aunt and my uncle, my mom, my grandmother, what have you, they do want to have that support. They do want to have that level of cultural understanding and relevancy for their loved one. In the absence of having these structures built and having them staffed and what have you, I think it's very incumbent upon families, communities as well, to all work together to make sure that they have people with dementia have a safer experience within these institutions. But yes, there is becoming more of a demand for that.
Awesome, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Lori, we're going to have your question, and then after Lori, Len, we're going to go to you for your question or comment.
Okay, hi Ngozi.
Hi.
Hi. My father does that too. He's 92 years old and he does the high five to greet people. I think that's a beautiful example of how we need to understand not only somebody's cultural habits, but also their personality.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
Yeah. And I love it when he does that. I think he learned it from his nephew.
Oh.
My question to you was, in throughout your research, my experience is as a family caregiver for both my parents. My mother had Alzheimer's for 5 years, and my father has dementia. The biggest obstacle we had in Quebec was the fact that my mother reverted to speaking only English, and all the government services there are basically in French. Did you look at that? I mean, Quebec is always doing things differently, but did that factor into your suggestion?
It did not, only because I was looking at, and I shouldn't, well, it can. I was looking at more culturally diverse immigrant seniors, not to exclude those in Quebec who might be immigrants who are coming from French-speaking countries or English-speaking countries, and then having the cross of the language and the cultures there. But I will certainly look into that. I was actually at a conference in Moncton just last month, and there was an organization there. If you want to give me information after, I can maybe pass that along to you. They also support people with dementia in a cross-language context as well. But I myself, my research doesn't necessarily speak to that. It does speak to language as a generalized, but not specifically for the French population and how that impacts. But I imagine there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, because you talk about the social determinants of health, and then I was just trying to think out myself what are the factors that culture impacts, because you talked about food. Language is certainly one of them. Is there a listing of like, I would consider my mother culturally separate from the French Canadian population that she was living within.
Okay.
Because she was Scottish heritage.
Okay.
Immigrants, well, she was born in Canada, so she's a Canadian, but culturally she is different from what the government insists is the culture in that province.
Yeah. No,
I don't know if that's a cultural question or just a language question.
Well, I mean, culture encompasses a lot of things, a lot of practices. For example, one cultural practice, like in some immigrant communities, for example, they don't necessarily like having people in the home, right, who are not relatives, right? So when we talk about someone who's going to take care of someone who has dementia, right, usually you call it a cousin or someone's godson or grandson or what have you, not a stranger, a PSW, a stranger coming into the home. And that's sort of a cultural barrier that I found. That I found as well for some people trying to get that home support. So for your mother, who's coming from, she was born in Canada, but her parents were not born in Canada? Were her parents born in Scotland?
Her mother was from the United States and her father was from Scotland.
Okay, so there's a cultural difference as well there that your mother would have that she'd be reverting back to, that might be informed by some Scottish practices and even some American practices, and I'm assuming English American, and that may be at odds with the French cultural practices when it comes to supporting someone with dementia or healthcare in general.
Well, I think it's very specific to Quebec. That's why I asked if you looked at it, because the Quebec government, of course, insists that its staff and all the employees speak French first. We had such difficulties getting support in English, and I know it's just specific to Quebec, so I don't want to spend too much of your time going on about it, but I think it's an important factor for people living in that province.
That's a great idea. Thank you. I'm going to actually put that down for something for me to explore in my research. Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go. Good question there, Lori. You get into the research.
Thank you. It's a research stream for me to explore. Thank you.
Mary, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I actually have 3 comments for things. One is long-term care wait list.
Okay.
I don't know about other provinces. I know in Ontario, at least in Ottawa, there are differences, especially in some of the ethnic home, with the wait list being much longer for men than women.
Okay.
Because of sharing bathroom. I know in a basic room, men can wait up to 4 years longer for a basic room, and semi-private, maybe up to a year more.
Okay.
And private, because they don't share a bathroom, it's not gender specific, so that doesn't matter. Second is I don't know about all the cultures, but I know at least in the Chinese culture, they try to keep their seniors and elders at home as long as they can. So what's coming through when both dad and mom is in the Grief Center now, which is a nonprofit long-term care. And I look at it, which the floor dad is in, the Chinese floor, versus the one mom is in, which is the general floor. The people are older and sicker on the Chinese floor. And but they have the same ratio.
Okay.
And that's a more subtle things, which I think is very hard to quantify and communicate to. And third thing is, this is also just, I don't know if you're doing some advocacy. I know when I was going to LIN board meetings, quality committee meetings, and finance meetings after the National Dementia Conference, I talked to somebody else in Ottawa that was trying to start a Chinese language dementia day program.
Okay.
They actually had a meeting with the CEO of the LIN, I believe, and trying to get funding for that. And they were told that they don't want to increase the number of partners.
They don't want to increase the number of
community partners they work with.
Oh.
So one of the things that would need to happen is like the Walking Council in Ottawa. There's like Jewish Family Services get additional funding, and they fund some subgroups, like the Arabic, the Chinese, etc. So I think if you have a position to do some advocacy, that's something which might be good to channel, because if for a particular ethnic group that want to day program 1 or 2 days a week,
right,
the health authority doesn't want to deal with that. But if they can found a master organization that funds the sub-ethnics groups, it's a kind of a master, like umbrella, that will allow more diverse programs to start and continue.
Okay.
Just a thought.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you. I'm just writing everything down here.
It's in the chat as well.
In the chat? Okay.
And also, Ngozi, we record this, so you'll be able to click on that link, and everyone, and hopefully you're going to send that link out to people, right?
Yeah, sorry, I'm in student mode. So when people start talking, I start writing things down, getting on my notes.
Okay, I do have a question coming in, and it's about Operation Olympics oppression.
Oppression Olympics, yes. Yes, so that's one of the critiques of intersectionality. So intersectionality, we're looking at people in the holistic sense, and looking at sort of the relationship that they have with states of within the state, in this case, the healthcare system. So Oppression Olympics is kind of a way of saying which group has a worse health status based on their immigration status or their cultural status, right? So are we thinking, do African Canadians have worse status, or is it South Asians, or is it Chinese speaking status? So one of the things on intersectionality is, how do you get around that? How do you get around this hierarchy as to which group or which community deserves more attention, and for how long and when and what have you? And so an intersectionality based approach looks at sort of the development of the policies and programs, and it looks at it from that aspect in a holistic context. So it's starting with the problem first, as opposed to the end, as opposed to the impact. So again, going back to the Ontario Dementia Strategy, I didn't look at it from the sake of, does this impact South Asians more, or Latin people more, or, I didn't look at it that way. I looked at the beginning of it, the actual consultation questions, the actual origins of the policy, and who was going to be able to be included and who was not going to be able to be included. And from a holistic perspective, it looked like those who fell outside of the assumptions of the Western way of framing dementia, those who fell outside of that framing were going to be the ones impacted. So that's what Oppression Olympics are, and sort of a way to circumvent that. Did that answer anyone's question? I don't know. I hope.
I think it did. Okay, any other? Stephanie, do you have a question? We're just going to unmute you. Oh, hang on. Hang on there, Stephanie. Can we unmute you? Lisa, are you able to unmute Stephanie, please?
I'm trying to unmute Stephanie. Stephanie, I don't know. Oh, there we go. You should work now.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. My question is with regards to early onset dementias. So I'm wondering how that's going to impact with people that are of different cultures or newly Canadians if they end up needing extra care with like dementia care. As they're dementia, you tend to seek out things. So if they're have not been in Canada 40, 50 years, and they've only maybe been in Canada 5, 6 years, or even maybe less, and they're diagnosed and with early onset, do you see that is going to be a whole other can of worms?
So my father, when he first began exhibiting signs and symptoms, I said, Dad, you're going to go to the doctor. He said, no, I'm not. I said, yes, you are. We're going to go to the doctor. And we sat with the doctor, and the doctor gave his assessment and told me thereafter, which then we told my father. And he at first was very much, no, I don't know. What is that? I don't know what that means. I don't want to do that. I was familiar with the healthcare system, so I was able to help that.
Yeah.
So for those who have early onset dementia, what I found when I was, and this is all from my research and when I was sitting in support groups and what have you, is a strong network for these people, a very strong network of family and friends to speak with them, to support them, to sit with them, and to advocate for them if they can at the healthcare, at the point of the healthcare institution interaction with whatever provider it is, to ensure two things. That, number one, the provider does not dismiss the person's claims, right? Either from a cultural context or any other context, does not dismiss their claims, and to help the person from that different background understand and accept what they're experiencing. Because oftentimes you'll have different cultural contexts where, no, I'm fine, I'm just forgetful, I'm just, I got my keys here, okay, it's fine. But having someone be their advocate, and again, as I was talking about those cultural institutions and organizations, alongside healthcare institutions and organizations can be really beneficial. In that instance, you can maybe leverage a community organization, someone to talk to explain things, to even help set up some sort of informal workshops, some informal campaigning in the community to get people really understanding sort of what dementia related issues are. Does that help?
Oh, I think she got muted.
I'm worried that from my experience that because they are younger, the ingrain of maybe stigma from their former country might make getting treatment and support more difficult, because there might be, like, I teach in a nursing class and I show World Health Organization videos often on this different stigmas around the world on mental health. I know dementia and mental health are two different things, but in another way they're really not. So I'm trying to navigate how that interpretation might be taken.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And in that case, I would say very much relying again on community.
Family
and community organizations, because they're the experts, right? They're going to know, and they're going to know the best way to frame dementia. Even maybe you don't want to. Maybe they don't want to hear dementia. Maybe they want to hear something else. Maybe it's framed in a different way that's relevant and safe for them, but still allows them to engage the healthcare system, right?
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah, absolutely. Good job. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So as a caregiver, I'm a caregiver for my husband, but as a nurse, my process would then be to follow what you're doing, is to make sure I have as many family members involved every step of the way in the treatment, so that they can do this more.
And
absolutely.
Actually, it's a domino effect, because that family is going to tell their friends, et cetera, et cetera. Once it becomes destigmatized, and once they can see the safety that their loved one is actually experiencing, and that, you know what, they're having some dementia-related illnesses, but they're in good hands. They're being treated well with dignity, and their health is improving or is stabilizing. They're in good hands. They're going to be more inclined
Yeah.
more open to talk about it and help destigmatize.
Awesome answer.
Okay, thanks for the question, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie.
The other person I have for you is Jessica. If you want to ask your question, and then we're going to flip over to Lori for possibly the last question. You might.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi. Sorry. No, you know what? I don't have a question. I was just listening intently. It's great. You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Jessica is actually, she's another student at York University, and she is doing very wonderful work as well, similar to the work that I'm doing. She's looking at ethno-racial communities, diverse communities in Canada as well, and access to dementia services. So her and I are colleagues in this area. So
hey, we'll have to talk, Jessica.
Yes.
There you go. All right, Lori, over to you.
It wasn't a question, it was just a comment. I just wanted to thank you, Ngozi, for going down this road, because I think it's so important that people